Welcome to the Americas 360 podcast. Get the inside scoop and the outside perspective on the latest developments from Canada, Latin America, and everywhere in between. Americas 360 is a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars.
Hello and welcome to Americas 360. I'm John Molesky. This program is brought to you by the world's #1 think tank for regional studies. And Americas 360 is a collaboration among the Wilson Center's Argentina Project, Brazil Institute, Canada Institute, Latin American Program, and Mexico Institute. Well, the Inter-American Development Bank mounted a momentous effort in 2020 to assist its member nations in responding to the economic and social impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. A record $21.6 billion in new financing was committed. In addition to facing the pandemic, the IDB provided aid to countries in Central America and the Caribbean affected by Hurricanes Eta and Iota. With the pandemic ongoing and a range of other issues facing the region, the IDB will continue to face both challenges and opportunities in the year ahead, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. And to do so, we're thrilled to welcome a very special guest to the Americas 360 Roundtable, the president of the Inter-American Development Bank, Mauricio Claver-Carone. You'll hear from him in just a minute, but first let's welcome back our regulars. Please say hello to Argentina Project Director Benjamin Gadet.
Hi there, John.
Latin American Program Director Cindy Arnson.
Hey, John.
Canada Institute Director Christopher Sands.
Glad to be here, John.
And Mexico Institute Director Duncan Wood, who'll also be moderating today's roundtable. Over to you, Duncan. Welcome back.
Thanks, John. Mauricio, first off, congratulations on your election to the presidency of the IDB. It's historic, and it comes at a critical time for the Americas, of course. The pandemic, economic recession, rising indebtedness, governance challenges everywhere, public security, corruption, and of course, a political transition here in the United States. I'd like to talk to you about these challenges, and then perhaps we can move on to talk about some of the opportunities that we see in the region. But let's begin. Why don't we begin with what you see as being the major challenges for the region in 2021, and perhaps what the role of the IDB is going to be in responding to those challenges, Mauricio.
Well, thank you so much, Duncan, again, and thank you for the invitation, and not only to be able to tell you a little bit about what we're doing from the Inter-American Development Bank, but also to hear your questions and your comments and really learn from you as well. All of you are diverse experts with years of experience in the region and obviously have a great pulse on what's happening. So look forward to this being the beginning of many conversations in this regards. Look, overall, and you named some of the challenges, and unfortunately, there's more you can add to that list as well. But I'd like to say that and kind of contextualize it in that the fact is that Latin America and the Caribbean faces the deepest socioeconomic crisis in the 61-year history of the IDB in that sense. Clearly, we're at a critical juncture, not only due to the COVID pandemic, but add to that the longstanding structural weaknesses that existed that have been exacerbated by the pandemic. We've seen recent natural disasters, the worst hurricane season in 50 years, the worst migration crisis in the world in regards to Venezuela, with a very poor international response to it, particularly if you compare it to the Syrian crisis, with about a tenth of the international attention monetarily than that of the Syrian crisis. And so, we've seen this huge amplification of the development gaps in the region as a result. You've all heard the statistics, and I'm not one to get boggled down on statistics, but you've all heard, obviously, GDP declined by 8% in 2020, total employment declined by 10%. What sticks to my head every day are three numbers. You have 25 million people that will be newly unemployed in the region, 44 million people that will be falling into poverty, newly falling into poverty, and 52 million that will be exiting the middle class after decades of effort to get them into the middle class. So it's quite a challenge when you put it all together. And then if you add to that kind of the consequences of what we've seen now in regards to COVID and what we like to call the triple sudden stop, the major disruptions in human mobility, trade, and capital flows, and you really have quite a crisis in your hands. Now, I'm a glass half full type of person. And, we can sit here and give you all the diagnostics, and you've heard it all of why things, we won't recover till 2023 per capita, GDP-wise till 2025, maybe 2028 in some countries like Mexico. You've heard all of that, but what we're really focused on is looking at opportunities. And just this week, we presented to a board what we call Vision 2025. And it really has a positive outlook to it. And we, instead of, calling it and falling into the trap of another lost decade, we've actually called this Vision 2025 Reinvest America as a decade of opportunity. Because I really do believe that as a result of the pandemic, there is a decade of the opportunity. And the IDB is going to play a big role. This is also why we've been focused on a capital increase, why we've been focusing on the priorities, which I'm sure we'll go more into. And I don't want to just answer everything in one question, but the real opportunities that we see from digitalization to nearshoring to small, medium-sized enterprise growth to really having a business line on climate gender. These are things that we can do to really bring this decade of opportunity to fruition. But we're going to need resources for that. And unfortunately, we don't have the resources necessary to do that. Last year, as was said in the introduction, was a record year. 2020, we contributed as a group over $21 billion to the region, but that's really a one-off. And we need to make sure that that's sustainable and that we continue to do so, because we've assessed through a capital note that we did in the first month of my presidency to the board that the needs of the region are somewhere in the $25 billion per year range. And our lending is really in the 14 to 16 billion in a normal year. So we're really going to need to really pick it up. And therefore, obviously, that's why a capital increase is extraordinarily important, but also why we have to be creative. And we're doing a lot of that, which I'd be happy to speak about as well.
Fantastic. That's a really good way to start. I know that Ben Gadan has a follow-up question on the capital increase for the bank, and I'd like to come back a little bit later on to focus on the question of the opportunities more broadly speaking in the region. But why don't we go over to Ben first of all to do the follow-up on capital issues?
Thanks, Duncan. And thanks again, Mauricio. We've talked about the IDB's robust response to the pandemic in 2020. As you pointed out, it's widely recognized that the IDB needs a lot more capital if it's to play the role the region needs from the IDB to restart economic activity. The IDB's last capitalization was back in 2010, when the bank received an additional $70 billion after a prolonged debate in the United States Congress. So my question is, what's your strategy for a new capitalization? You've talked, I think, persuasively about the need for additional resources, but I'm curious about your approach to the U.S. Congress, and in particular to some key figures in the Senate who were initially concerned about your candidacy to run the bank and who now probably need a bit of persuasion to approve such a large capital increase.
That's a great question, Ben. I appreciate it. Look, capital increases have never been easy for the bank. As a matter of fact, I've said that the IDB has been a bipartisan issue in the United States because there's been consensus that neither Democrats or Republicans have ever really stepped up to support the IDB in its history, I would like to say, definitely in its modern history. Even that capital increase in 2010, the United States came into it kicking and screaming. And at the end of the day, the Senate at the very end, or the Congress at the very end, particularly because of Republican resistance in Congress, essentially weighed in, and then a whole bunch of contingencies were put on it, and really hamstrung a lot of what the bank could do. By the way, when the merge out of IDB Invest, which we're talking about recovery after the COVID pandemic, and this recovery, to be real, we can help out, but it really has to be private sector led. IDB Invest is a wonderful tool, but when the merge out was done in 2015, the United States did not participate, period. As a matter of fact, our shareholding decreased, as well as Japan's and Spain's, and I think there's some issues there of concern, which we're trying to address moving on in the future. But that decrease that took place was actually to create room for China to come into IDB Invest. So you can see the direction things were going there, and I want to make sure we don't miss those opportunities again. So we're actually, for the first time, here I am 100 days into my presidency. And in 100 days into this presidency, we had in the first month, we presented a capital note to the board on the needs of the region. And again, it's common sense. The worst crisis. If we've had capital increases before, then think about it amidst the worst socioeconomic crisis in the 61 years of the bank. Common sense. COVID, all of those consequences we talked about. Add to that the worst hurricane season in 50 years, with 4 out of 5 countries most impacted by hurricanes right here in Central America and the Caribbean. The worst migrant crisis, not only in the history of the Western Hemisphere, but right now currently in the world, whereby the international community has only put forward about $200 per Venezuelan migrant versus over $2,000 for every Syrian migrant. If tomorrow, and I'm hopeful and I wish the incoming administration all the success, there's a democratic transition of sorts in Venezuela and there's a reconstruction effort which should be led, frankly, by the IDB, there's no money for it. There frankly is no money for it. As a matter of fact, Venezuela is $1 billion, nearly $1 billion in arrears with the bank. So we're talking about widespread needs. And if we get even closer into it, small, medium-sized enterprises, there's an $87 billion gap in that regard. If you talk about healthcare, you're talking about another $50 billion gap, digitalization, another $50 billion gap. There are huge gaps of financing in the region for all of these key issues. And I think that the case can be made. Now, I think we're ahead of the game because, one, we presented it from day one. We're looking now when we go to Argentina in March to get some sort of a mandate, either the formal mandate or to have another meeting in order to do so. So that would be at record speed. I think it's never moved in the history of the bank so quickly in that regard. You have legislation that was presented on a bipartisan basis by the authorizers, and obviously the authorizers are key here because most of this money is going to be in callable capital, which goes through the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and you have two key senators there, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Menendez, and obviously Senator Rubio, a key Republican in regards to the region, and the chairman are now ranking of the subcommittee on Western Hemisphere on the authorizing committee to present that. So I think that that's a really good sign. You've never seen, the Senate has always in a bipartisan way lagged way behind. Here they are now leading in that effort, and that bill will be introduced with more senators in a bipartisan fashion in the next few weeks. And I think that's also a positive sign. Now, look, the good news is there are more senators in a bipartisan basis that are supportive than are not. And my goal is that even those that are not, and look, in fact, clearly the incoming chairman of the Appropriations Committee, Senator Leahy, had issues with my running for the presidency and my being elected. And I respect that. I respect his opinion. But I'm sure, and I hope he gives us the opportunity to really give a good case on the merits of why this is important. And for the United States to lead, because one of the greatest legacies we can live here, and what I'm focused on in the IDB, is not only to leave a new IDB for the new generation in 5 years, but to leave one that is more robust financially, that has a greater adherence, which I know something Senator Leahy and just about every member cares about, but greater adherence to transparency and compliance standards, that has modern 21st century offerings and vehicles for countries in the region, but most importantly, that has a strengthened, renewed U.S. commitment where we can say that U.S. support for the IDB is a bipartisan issue. And if we can do that together with the incoming administration, with the Congress, not only will the United States be better for it because the neighborhood where we live in, and our friends and our partners and our neighbors will be stronger, but vice versa. And I think that that's a great thing for everybody. It's a good case to make.
Mauricio, thank you. This is Cindy. I have a question about levels of indebtedness and the ratios of debt to GDP. You've talked about, even before the pandemic, the structural problems in the region. Do you think that regional economies are going to recover in a robust way that would allow people to be able to pay these huge loans? And is this something that could become politically contentious as people want governments to spend money on needs at home and not paying back international financial institutions?
That's a great question, Cindy. And, just this weekend, I was listening to my friend and colleague and who I widely respect, the managing director of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva, who was saying, the number one remedy right now is to keep spending. And once you're done spending, spend some more. So that's the recipe right now that's coming from the multilateral world. Look, the good news is here, we offer a wide variety of products. And we have to be, let me first from the IDB perspective and kind of from the broader macro perspective. From the IDB perspective, we offer a wide variety of products. So, what I'm talking about when we discuss $20 billion per year is not simply lending. We're not talking overall about policy-based loans. We're not talking about, budget support in that regards, which, by the way, there's a whole other conversation that needs to take place in the IDB about PBLs and budget support in that regards. That's something that's been, let's just say, too loosey-goosey for decades. But, that's something that, we have a wide variety of products. That includes, when we talked about last year's $21.6 billion, that includes infrastructure, that includes technical assistance. That includes this very wide menu. And I think we need to be more creative in that regard. Now, indeed, we are seeing countries in the region that, their average debt ratios have, has gone up into the 70s from the mid 50s. And I think that that's of concern, and that's something we're following closely. I'm particularly concerned, as is frankly Kristalina, about the smaller islands in the Caribbean and smaller countries that are going to have their growth impeded, particularly because they are too dependent on particular industries like tourism, et cetera. And then we're working really closely on some of these islands in the Caribbean and other smaller countries that are dependent on certain industries. And by the way, have had kind of the triple whammy, right? COVID, which of course shuts down travel, which therefore shuts down tourism. And then, by the way, worst hurricane season in 50 years. So you've had, a triple whammy in that regards. So, for those countries in particular, we do need to find ways to provide them support, to provide them flexibility in vehicles. We're soon to launch what we call the hurricane clause. We're actually the first multilateral to do so. Hurricane clauses in contracts for some of these countries in the Caribbean and Central America that will provide them longer maturities if there is a climate event that takes place. But I think we need to go beyond that, right? And I think there is an effort along with the fund and the World Bank in order to see how we can provide some relief to these countries. For the countries that have more multi-sectoral, et cetera, we are really focused on recovering from COVID. We're doing everything we can to help them really pivot so they can accelerate their economy, so they can grow again. And at the end of the day, that's going to be the key. Not only have we been asking countries to spend more, but also because of COVID, asking them to halt consumption and production, which has been obviously then led to what I just discussed, that whole triple sudden stop. So we need to get them back in path of growth. And what we can do there is really the vaccine effort. And that's why one of the things that we did in the 100 days is something really that would have been unprecedented at the IDB were it not for the wonderful leadership team that's there, the vice presidents that have come to place and have broken silos. I said October 1st that we wanted to create teams that the bank worked as a group and we break silos. So you saw our vice president of countries and our vice president of sectors work together and identify. They literally identified and reprogrammed $1 billion to dedicate solely to the vaccine effort. And we had to do so because at the end of the day, that's an investment that we make for countries to be able to pivot, move past the current crisis, and then start growing so they can create more space in that regards. Every loan we make, every project we finance, everything we do, we look very closely and we're very conscious in that regards. One of the reasons that I actually even selected and the board approved Richard Martinez, who was a former finance minister of Ecuador, to become the vice president of countries was with this whole issue of debt and debt restructurings in mind. IDB has never really played a role, does not have a formal mechanism for technical assistance or support with debt restructuring. And we actually created that. We actually created a team led by Richard. Part of the reason I selected Richard is because he was not only recognized as Finance Minister of the Year last year by Global Capital, but for good reason. Here's someone that earned the respect of the multilaterals, 3 IMF programs he negotiated, obviously IDB, World Bank, had to negotiate with the Chinese restructuring, had the good graces of the Chinese and the United States, really won their respect, and a private bond restructuring that took place with Ecuador to really try to bring them back, to actually successfully bring them back into the international financial system in that regards, with challenges ahead and an election ahead, but did really a tremendous job in that regards. And he's leading that effort, keeping in mind the challenges that countries are facing, particularly, as you mentioned, as their ratios go up.
This is Chris Sands from the Canada side of things. In terms of adding to the capital that the bank has to work with, I'm sure Canada, like other countries, will be feeling the pinch for domestic. Are you getting a good response on adding to the capital reserves for the bank from Canada, but also from the United States and others?
So look, I think there's generally, there's a good consensus in the region in regards to a capital increase. I think Canada has been a great partner. We've been working very closely with Canada, and they have obviously some priorities. I think that where you see a little bit of the, I wouldn't say resistance, but reluctance to a degree is in Europe, because obviously they have other priorities. And, Europeans always tend to look at, perhaps with the exception of Spain, tend to look at Africa first, and that be their priority. So, that conversation is taking place. But we're making a very strong case for it, and Canada has been great. Canada has been a leader, particularly gender as well as climate issues. And in that regard, one of the things that we've been doing in addition to, and we can talk about it with the priorities, is not only, and this is also very helpful with the Europeans, not only, focusing on the digitalization side, the nearshoring or integration, as we call it, particularly because the Europeans don't like the term nearshoring, the whole concept of small, medium-sized enterprises, but not just paying lip service. We're actually, and this is something we're looking to present as well in Barranquilla in March. I think the IDB has been very good in regards to climate from in a transversal way, and obviously our ESG standards are, I would say, best in class. However, one of the things that we learned when we came in is for all the lip service that we provide on climate and gender, we don't have a business line independent for both of them. So on climate, we actually have to crutch on some of the global funds in order to finance climate projects, which are tedious, they take too long, and they're complex and bureaucratic. We're actually looking to create our own vehicle to finance climate projects in the region. And there's a huge opportunity there, whether it's with the Rhodesia project in Colombia and the 7 Amazon countries there or elsewhere. And in that regard, in regards to gender, while every project has to, essentially check a box on gender, there's not a pipeline of business that's focused on gender. And there's so much we can do in that regard. And Canada has been a particular leader in that regard and working really closely on that. And we're launching our own framework on gender. And just last week, one of the things that I would like to replicate and scale, we launched a pilot project along with PepsiCo, the company, in Guatemala, Dominican Republic, and Ecuador, whereby, and this goes great with the whole integration issue, whereby we're helping female agricultural entrepreneurs, particularly that are in the field of potatoes, so they can essentially create, we can help them foment small, medium-sized farms that they can then scale, grow, and then at the end of that pipeline, you have PepsiCo, which obviously owns Frito, that will purchase those potatoes from those female entrepreneurs. So those are things that we can scale in that regard. That's something that Canada's been a great leader in across the board. And obviously, look, in the Caribbean, Central America, they've also been great leaders. So I think from a Canada perspective, we have a great working relationship. They have an extraordinary executive director, Bob Ash, who is a former ambassador in Colombia, someone of great standing. And we're really lucky to have them. We're working really, really well together. So Canada is a leader in the IDB, and we look forward to working. In regards to the United States, I think, obviously we're going through a transition here, and obviously when, it depends, right? We have a new Secretary of Treasury, and we look forward to making the case to Treasury as well. I think from a technical level, Treasury has an idea of where, and obviously the career staff at Treasury, which is obviously very well versed and very well informed, has been following for a while. They have probably of where they want to be at, but obviously that depends on how quickly the new leadership can settle, which is why either we'd love to get a mandate in March or at the very latest in September, but we're really pushing for March.
Mauricio, I would love to come back to an issue that you raised a couple of times before we run out of time here, and that's nearshoring. And you talked a little bit about that in your answer to Chris just now. But to me, it seems as though, despite all the problems, the region remains one that is full of opportunities as well. And in terms of nearshoring, I mean, we talk about it most commonly with regards to Mexico and Canada, but of course, there are many other countries in the region that could benefit from this phenomenon that we're seeing right now. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about what you see as the IDB's role in that.
That's a great question. Look, people say it's been my obsession. It's my obsession because it's very real. One of the other things that we've been doing that I'm very proud of in the last 100 days, there's not a day that goes by that I have not talked to a CEO or executive at a major U.S. company, at institutional investors, financial institutions, et cetera, who for a long time have really not seeing the IDB as a guide towards, investment, et cetera, in the region. And there's an argument to be made, is that really our role or not? I think it is. Because that's what we have, a whole office of integration. We obviously as well have the American Business Dialogue, and there's been such excitement in the private sector about what we're doing. And they actually have asked us to staff up the American Business Dialogue, which we're going to do, which is going to be key as well for the Summit of the Americas coming up. Nearshoring is real. I've seen at least 2 studies that show about 2/3 of U.S. companies in China are making plans or are considering moving their operations. I had this argument with the Europeans because they think nearshoring is some type of geopolitical issue, and I say it's not. The IDB is not out there advocating for nearshoring or instigating nearshoring, but nearshoring is happening. It's taking place because companies have realized that it's good for them to be closer to these markets. It's also, by the way, it's also good for the communities, it's good for the environment, it's good for a whole bunch of reasons. So since it's happening, my job is to ensure that as much of that relocation takes place in our 26 borrowing nations as possible, because nothing has a greater socioeconomic impact for people than job creation. And those companies go and they create jobs, and they're doing it. And it's become almost now this kind of buzz whereby I get calls. Just last week, I got a call from a major pharmaceutical company that they're going to move a major operation to a Central American country. Car companies from Asia moving towards Uruguay. They call us up. The chief investment officer of a major life insurance company or insurance company generally, which wants to put $1 billion more into the region, relocated from elsewhere, put it into the region, and asked us for what we see as opportunities, et cetera. We created this kind of buzz and momentum and race, and in the next couple of weeks in mid-February, we're actually going to sign. I'm about action, and we're going to sign with about over 24 of the biggest global companies an action plan where they're committing to not just talking about the region, et cetera, but they're committing to increasing investments in the regions because the opportunities are there. Now, granted, some countries are making it easier than others in that regards, and that's good. That competition is good as well. Some countries are doing great jobs attracting that investment and creating the infrastructure and creating the business climate for those investments, and some aren't. But those success stories are going to want to be emulated, and I think that opportunity is there. So, what's our job? Also in Barranquilla is one of the priorities, and I could probably give you the whole list at some point because I've given you so many priorities in Barranquilla, but there's really 5, is a nearshoring toolkit. We've actually launched a nearshoring toolkit. When I was still in the U.S. government, I really wanted to do this whole Back to the Americas initiative because I could see this nearshoring kind of starting to develop, taking place, particularly after COVID. But we just don't have the information. I remember I asked the Commerce Department, give us the comparative advantage of each country so that we can measure, where we need to be focused on and be matchmaking, et cetera. And there was resistance for a host of reasons in the U.S. government for that regards. But also, we couldn't just come up with the information. At the IDB, obviously, because we have a presence in all 26 foreign nations, and we know the ministries, and we have such a level of trust and knowledge there, we came up with that information right away. And a study was done right away. And let me just leave you with this on this issue. If the region simply captured 10% of what the United States currently imports from China, that the region already produces. So I'm not talking about creating a whole new business line, a whole new facility, et cetera, of projects of industries and goods and widgets that are already kind of cross-import, let's say, that both China and the region. If we just captured 10%, if the region captured 10% of that, that would be $70 billion worth of exports per year, additional exports per year for the region. Huge impact to job creation, et cetera. That excitement is there. People are seeing it. Our job is to really help guide that. I think the companies, the private sector is excited about what we're doing. They're excited we're working as a group. Look, it's part of the leadership team. We announced in our leadership team, the executive vice president, who's the number 2, who, by the way, now is the highest ranking Latin American woman in the history of the IDB, Irene Mejia, who is a former CEO of Citibank in Central America. I mentioned Richard. I mentioned Benigno Lopez, our vice president of sector, who used to be the finance minister of Paraguay. We promoted our CFO, Gustavo Rosa, to be vice president of finance. But now when we have leadership meetings, we actually include IDB Invest and IDB Lab. We really are looking, which by the way had never in meetings been included as part of the leadership team, because we really need to have a group effort. And that includes the private sector, because the reality is it doesn't matter what we do, the growth that is needed in the region and those opportunities that exist have to be led by the private sector. And I think that if we leave that confidence and we bring that confidence to the private sector to help be good stewards, good stewards of brands, good stewards of the region and of what we think, kind of like as we see, look, as you know, institutional investors, they always look, they have, essentially very objective standards. If you're an OECD country, that checks a box and that allows a whole bunch of cash to be made available for investment. If we can create our own kind of standard, our own kind of OECD-like standard that bringing that confidence to the region, we can promote a lot of investment and therefore job creation, which has all sorts of development impact. We can also help bring it to underdeveloped areas, to areas with vulnerable populations. Obviously huge impact for climate, environment, due to shorter distances, et cetera. By the way, investors see this. I'm very proud, and there's a host of reasons. But just last week, we issued our 10-year sustainable bond, and we expected to raise about $2 billion with it, and we raised $4 billion. We doubled it, and we had demand for $5 billion, and it was the most successful bond offering in the history of the IDB. Over 100 investors. Now, granted, there's good timing, there's good pricing, but investors are seeing what we're doing. We're talking to them. They're excited about the opportunities, and we had the best bond offering as a result of that in the history of the IDB, and I think there's a lot more to come.
I'm sincerely sorry we're out of time, but the good news is we covered a lot of important issues in a short amount of time. Mauricio Claver-Carone, thank you very much for joining us today. I know I speak for my colleagues when I thank you for being here.
Thank you so much again for the invitation. I appreciate it.
Well, we look forward. I understand you'll be back for a Wilson Center event in March, and we can continue this conversation, and we look forward to that then. Thanks again. So we hope you enjoyed this edition of America's 360 and that you'll choose to join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.
You have been listening to America's 360, a podcast about the innumerable ties among the nations of the Western Hemisphere. America's 360 is produced and edited by Oscar Cruz, Angela Robertson, and Mariana Sanchez Ramirez. You can subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. To learn more about our programs, please visit wilsoncenter.org. And please join us again next time for another episode of America's 360.